This lecture continues our conversation from week 2 about the history and the theories that contributed to Bowen's thinking. Now we'll discuss the 8 main concepts of Bowen Family Systems Theory, and I encourage you to think about what we discussed in week 2 and think about how those assumptions and theories contributed to the development of these concepts. So Bowen proposed that there are 2 complementary life forces at work in human relationships. One that promoted togetherness and one concerned with individuality or separateness. Each of these forces motivates the individual to preserve the integrity of both their own person as well as their relational systems with other people. All systems, individuals, couples, families, institutions, have the primary goal of viability. That is, the ability to survive. You may recall from our discussions in week 2 about the triune brain, MacLean theorized that the older sections of the brain served 2 primary functions: self-preservation and species preservation. So we can see that analogy continuing here into this assumption of Bowen theory. Threats to viability provoke anxiety in the system. Threats to an individual's viability may include actual threats to a person's life, such as poor health, car accidents, abuse. But keep in mind that threats can also be very small, such as in our example last week of being told that you're wrong in an argument with somebody. This would not be perceived as a threat to everyone, but in the person whose emotional system processes this as a threat, their reaction could potentially be problematic. Threats to a couple's viability could include emotional distance or conflict, infidelity, environmental circumstances. As we read in Papero's chapter 2, he talked about couples trying to eliminate differences between one another. That in times of anxiety, they want to be perceived as the same, which we also talked about in couples therapy when we looked at structural couples therapy as well. So that's another example of something that could provoke anxiety. So perceived differences between the couple. Interestingly, many things considered threats to viability can also be considered symptoms, which are responses to threats. For example, a couple experiencing emotional distance as a threat to their viability might then experience infidelity as a means of pushing the couple into crisis so that they are forced to attend to the emotional distance. They might then decrease the distance and repair the relationship, or increase the distance and dissolve the relationship. It depends on which sense of viability triumphs in that situation. Is this about self-preservation or the relationship preservation? The nature of threats and symptoms is often cyclical and repeats over the course of a relationship. Some systems are able to handle threats to viability well, others are not. For example, the couple we just talked about could have started a dialogue about how their progressive emotional distancing is threatening their relationship viability. Of course, they would not use those words. Or they could have sought couples therapy prior to it reaching the point where infidelity became the natural symptom that followed the threat. One way of explaining the various reactions to threats to viability is through differentiation. We talked about various definitions of differentiation in week 2. Another one is the ability to maintain one's own autonomy while allowing other components of a system to do the same. Poor differentiation leads to emotional reactivity, which is the inability to distinguish and choose between cognitive and affective reactions in anxiety-provoking situations. So this is what we discussed about the thinking system, or the intellectual system, and the feeling system, and in times of high anxiety being able to kind of acknowledge what's going on in each and make a choice really about how one responds. So you can see here in this figure, right? So a threat comes into the system, and differentiation moderates how a system responds or reacts to that threat. So higher levels of differentiation allow a response. So something intentional, chosen. Lower levels of differentiation would mean that a reaction's occurring in direct response to the threat, in a state of high anxiety, and may look like emotional reactivity, which we'll talk about as cutoff and fusion being representations of emotional reactivity. So emotional reactivity is the inability to distinguish between emotions, cognitions, and the response to the trigger. And you can cut off from your emotions or your cognitions as well, which we sort of got into in week 2 and will continue to discuss as we go along. So primary cause of interpersonal anxiety, and therefore threats to viability, is the inability to comfortably manage emotional distance or closeness, or to uphold what we'd call healthy distance regulation between people in relational systems. Distance regulation is a similar concept to differentiation in that it's related to an ability to be autonomous within the context of a relationship. People in relational systems are in constant dialogue with one another, of course not necessarily verbal, in which they fluctuate between closeness and distance. This is a natural dance that's continually happening. Healthy distance regulation keeps system members close, but not too close. Individuals retain their own identities while holding the system's identity as well. System members who are too close may become fused with one another, and this can lead to high levels of conflict, as the individuals would be highly reactive to each other's emotions. People who are too distant can experience cutoff or loss of relationship from one another. I should clarify that cutoff isn't necessarily a symptom of distance. Rather, cutoff and fusion are two sides to the same coin. We only cut off from people. We're only able to really cut off in the way that Bowen meant it from people that we're fused with. Right? So cutoff is an extreme reaction to high levels of fusion. So if you think about it, you wouldn't really firmly cut off from somebody that didn't provoke reactions in you, from somebody that you weren't really attached to their emotional system. So we cut off from people, who really anger us or really upset us or really hurt us. So we're still very fused with them emotionally. And cutoff is one way of dealing with the anxiety of that fusion and our reactivity to that person. And so cutoff, I'll discuss a little bit later in the presentation. So other than that, distance can result in, symptoms that then pull people closer, or inevitably could result in, the relational system dissipating. So I'll often use differentiation and distance regulation as interchangeable terms. They don't necessarily mean the exact same thing, but I see distance regulation as sort of a manifestation of differentiation in relationships. They are very much interlocking constructs, and particularly when we're looking at human relational systems, distance regulation, I think, is a good way to operationalize differentiation and what the emotional system is doing. So differentiation was the first concept of Bowen's 8 concepts, and triangles are the second. Triangles can be, at first, a confusing concept to grasp if you don't understand that triangles are a normal, natural, predictable behavior. A triangle in and of itself is not problematic. If you think about a stool, right? A stool needs 3 legs to stand. That's a natural existence of a stool, right? And in living systems, triangles are normal and natural constructions, right? But within a triangle, a dyad, a two-person relationship, can exist comfortably when it's calm, and it can exist in relation to a third entity also when it's calm. However, when that dyad becomes anxious, so for example, when there's threats to the dyad or threats to individuals in the dyad, that dyad can then involve a third entity as a way of managing the anxiety. So, three people existing in relation to one another is not necessarily a problem if they're all able to sort of maintain their own identities as individuals and maintain identities as dyads, and potentially, if appropriate, maintain an identity as a triad. But when anxiety is high between two people, a third person is often co-opted to help manage and diffuse that anxiety. So that's what Bowen means when we say intensity can move around the sides of the triangle. So a classic example would be two partners fighting, having conflict, and so there's anxiety between them, and one partner reaches out to a friend and complains about the partner or their mother, right? We love that example. They reach out to their mother. They've triangled their mother, and they're complaining to the mother and venting, and now the anxiety is between them and the mother, right? The partner and the mother. And so the person vents, they start to feel better, the anxiety dissipates between those two. But now the mother or the friend is mad at the other partner. And so now the anxiety exists in that relationship, but it has been removed from the dyad, at least temporarily. And that's the problem with triangulation, which is the problematic triangle. The problem with triangulation is that it doesn't resolve the anxiety in the long term. It's essentially a quick fix. The anxiety will continue to come back around until it's fully addressed. And of course, we create lots of triangles, or we exist in lots of triangles because, like I said, they're normal, natural. And with enough anxiety in a system, those can become what we call interlocking triangles, where there are a lot of other people or entities involved in the relationship that can be used to manage anxiety, and it can move amongst those triangles. And now triangles do not only have to be people. I look at a lot of other entities, which we may also consider symptoms, as points on a triangle as well. So substances can be a third point of a triangle. Work can be a third part of the triangle. You'll see this very easily with couples. And as we discussed in couples class, as a therapist, your job is to kind of enter the triangles of the family without being triangulated. And we'll discuss different ways of doing that as we talk about clinical work with Bowen therapy. In his clinical families, Bowen observed that families with high anxiety and low differentiation generally manifested 4 different patterns in their family symptoms and family problems. And now these 4 patterns don't necessarily exist in isolation. They're not whole or mutually exclusive concepts. Very often we see them happening in the same family as part of a cycle. So each partner, when you form a new family or a partnership, you bring in your own level of differentiation. You bring in your own relational patterns from your family of origin. And that starts to form a new emotional system with the patterns from each kind of contributing. And if we have low differentiation coming in and there's high anxiety, so maybe high demands to adapt, then we can see that resulting in different patterns. One would be emotional distance. Now that could be actual physical distance, being separated from one another, or there could be emotional distance in the sense of not being connected to one another, not communicating with one another. The thing here to remember is that even though the partners are emotionally distant, they're still emotionally very preoccupied with one another. So they're not distant in the sense that they've grown apart and they don't really feel connected. There's still high reactivity in that they're not spending time together, but they're still very reactive to the other person. This can look like a pursuer-distancer cycle if it rigidifies and repeats over time. Marital conflict, we know that well, serves a function, right? Because it is characterized by a cycle of distance and closeness, right? Typically, distance either precedes or proceeds the conflict, and closeness does the vice versa. So the conflict acts as a way of kind of rebalancing the scales in either direction. This is easily seen in a cycle of violence, right, where there's increasing closeness between the partners, that's increasing tension and anxiety, and that's relieved by a crisis of some physical altercation. And then distance creates an anxiety wars. And there's Nelson. Okay, so the third pattern in the nuclear family emotional process is transmission to a child. And we see this often, and we talk about this a lot in structural therapy when we look at kind of a focal child or a symptom bearer. And the transmission to a child can look a lot of different ways. It could be positive, loving, kind of overly focused, maybe a little smothering of the kid, or a nagging worry, worrying about the child, worrying about a symptom. And typically, as we see, the child behaves as expected, right? So if we expect the child to be a superstar, they will likely do everything in their power to be a superstar. If we expect, the child has a lot of anxiety and emotional issues, then the child's going to have a lot of anxiety and emotional issues. And of course, the function of this transmission is that it reduces anxiety. And this is not any one parent's fault when this happens. What Bowen would emphasize is that this is the result of generations of patterns where this has been a functional way of reducing anxiety in the family. The final pattern is dysfunction in a spouse. So this is when one spouse is basically continually under-functioning, whether that's through a chronic illness, whether emotional or physical, unemployment or underemployment, substance use, basically a pattern of one person always having to do the caretaking or making the decisions or being in power. That can become very fixed and very automatic, and we would call that over and under functioning pattern, which we see. So the family projection process is just really highlighting the process through which each person acquires their basic level of differentiation. So differentiation is initially determined by your family of origin, and it's a mix of, as with everything in Bowen's theory, it's a mix of different factors. There's a biological genetic component, and through the intergenerational transmission process, we also have the social component. So how children experience interactions and anxiety in their family as they grow up. Because of this process, it is highly likely that a child with poorly differentiated parents will also be poorly differentiated. It is possible for that child to become more or less differentiated than their parents, but generally they land within one standard deviation, if you will, of their parents' level. Now, the multi-generational transmission process basically looks at the family projection process over a longer period of time. So it's repeated generation after generation. And in that, we see a compounding of differentiation. So what I mean is that siblings in one family often wind up with slightly different levels of differentiation. Often there's a focal child, a symptom bearer, and that child tends to become less differentiated than the parents. And other siblings can attain about the same level or possibly slightly higher levels of differentiation than their parents. So then each sibling then creates their own family that becomes more or less intense, and basically it creates these progression lines throughout a family where one line kind of is moving towards higher differentiation and maybe another line through the family is moving towards lower differentiation. And Bowen theorized that the results of progressively lower differentiation throughout multiple generations was how we saw major emotional illnesses such as schizophrenia, chronic alcoholism, chronic illness. But like with anything, there's many factors involved. So societal, environmental changes can ease this process or accelerate it. Of course, there's a biological component here as well. But basically that over generations, families would kind of progressively move in one direction or another based on this process and based on how differentiation was passed down to different siblings and then on from there. So speaking of siblings, Bowen's concept of sibling position was based in Thoman's research on the same. Walter Thoman observed hundreds of, quote, healthy families, and he noticed patterns of behavior and roles based on rank and sex. So rank being if you're oldest, middle, youngest, only child, a twin, and sex, of course, based on your assigned gender. So if you're a boy or a girl in the family. So for example, an oldest sister of sisters often takes on an authoritative caretaker role where she values responsibility and power over material goods and is often perceived as intimidating. She may also be overprotective of her children if she has them and will value children over her partner, especially if the partner's male. So these patterns intersect with many other contextual factors in the family. For example, a child with a severe disability can shift the sibling ranks. So if you have an older child with a disability, typically a younger child will then take on the older sibling role. Large age gaps can also change the roles. When constructing genograms, I always find it interesting to pay attention to the patterns of sibling positions throughout the generations. So are the parents in complementary or non-complementary positions? What about the parent and the child who are most in conflict? What do their positions look like? And the positions are not meant to be reductive or predictive, but it's another way to describe patterns and roles that are passed down through families. So what is an example of a complementary position? So in a couple, a complementary position would be an oldest sibling matched with the youngest sibling. Their roles and patterns would likely fit together more easily than, say, two oldest or two youngest. But there's also a risk that these roles could then become rigidified to the point where there would be no room for adapting in the couple relationship. So if you have high anxiety and low differentiation, this type of pairing could easily become an over-under functioner pattern. Right, so that dysfunction in a spouse in the nuclear family emotional process. So just take some time when you're reading through the sibling position to think about kind of your position in the family and what your role was. Do you find yourself playing a similar role in your family of creation or in your intimate relationships? And what's your position compared to your partner's? And is that something that creates harmony or creates conflict in your relationship? And the last concept that we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint is emotional cutoff. Many people think of emotional cutoff as the ultimate distance. However, emotional cutoff is really a form of fusion. In highly anxious, intense relationships, individuals may cut off as a way of managing the anxiety of that relationship. But as we know, this is only a superficial fix. Any interaction with that person, whether real or imagined, is going to still produce anxiety and emotional reactivity. Plus, the person who cut off is going to experience that same fusion in their future relationships. So it may not be immediately bothering them in the relationship that they cut off from, but it's going to resurface. That anxiety is still present. It's not resolved. However, smaller amounts of distance you can think of as sort of a safety valve of the emotional system. So a little distance can relieve anxiety and be healthy, as opposed to being fused and very close to another person all the time. So because of the issues with emotional cutoff, because it doesn't resolve the anxiety and the anxiety reappears in other relationships, Bowen strongly advocated for resolving emotional cutoffs. And so in class next week, we're going to put some of these concepts into practice. So we're going to watch some clips from the show Supernatural, and a case summary, a genogram. We're going to apply these constructs and talk about them further. So please, in your blog posts, highlight areas of confusion that still exist for you, or come to class, prepared with your questions and your understanding of the concepts. And we're going to start to play with them and really understand them, because they're going to form the basis for our language and our application for the rest of the semester. So that's Bowen's first 7 concepts. The 8th concept is about societal regression, or emotional processes in society, which is really more a broader application of the theory than a clinical application, but it's still a really interesting one. So we'll probably talk about that more as the semester moves on. All right, thank you.